Now, this is interesting. China and Russia have just been elected to the United Nations Human Rights Council. The two nations were voted onto the 47-member council in a secret ballot yesterday, but their appointment is coming under fire since both have been condemned internationally for their human rights records. China has been most recently criticized for its treatment of Uyghur Muslims and its handling of pro-democracy protests in Chinese-controlled Hong Kong. Now, as you might imagine, Israel and the U.S. are some of the main critics here. The U.S. actually quit the Human Rights Council back in 2018 over what it claims is chronic bias against Israel and a lack of real reform. Well, we have the editor-in-chief and the CEO of the Algemeiner joining us from New York, Dovid Efune. So first of all, break down what the UN Human Rights Council actually does. What is their role?
Well, ostensibly, and I start with the words ostensibly because never has there really been a greater gulf between the intention and the actuality of an institution. Ostensibly, it's supposed to look out for and advocate for human rights around the world and against human rights violators. In actuality, it spends most of its time criticizing Israel, which of course is the one democracy in the Middle East and in a region that's full of dictatorial regimes. Since 2006, there have been over 90 condemnations of Israel, a lot more than all human rights violators put together, including the likes of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and those that are pretty well known to be among the worst human rights defenders in the world.
Well, what does it mean now that China and Russia have been elected? I mean, what kind of impact will their leadership have in a council like this?
Well, the election of Russia and China have been referred to a case of the foxes guarding the hen house. But in actuality, it's more like a perpetual barbecue where the foxes are actually roasting the chickens all day and all night. What we're going to see is more shielding and protecting of human rights violators, especially those like China and Russia, who you have mentioned before, and Cuba, who was also elected just now, and a lot more going after and finger pointing at regimes that, while they maybe not be perfect, or countries, democracies like Israel and even the United States, it's sort of a deflection, bait and switch, if you will. And really, as Ambassador Erdogan, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, described it, a cover-up, a farce.
Now, this certainly is not the first time that nations accused of major human rights violations have been elected to the council. Why does this continue to happen in your eyes?
Well, it's really a product of an institutional flaw around the way that the United Nations is structured. In the end of the day, all governments are treated by the United Nations as equal. We know, of course, that not all systems of government are equal. And unfortunately, there are a large amount of countries around the world that are governed by dictatorships and theocracies and all kinds of forms of government that are not favorable for human rights and the treatment of minorities and the citizens in general. So a much better version of the United Nations, which of course is a pipe dream to even speak of, would be one whereby a commitment to human rights was actually rewarded with greater influence and greater strength and opportunity within the forums of the United Nations. What we have today is that all voices are treated equal, and you end up with large groups of human rights violators and really badly run countries making decisions that affect everybody around the world.
All right, now you spoke about Israel and basically about its coverage in the UN Human Rights Council. Israel's ambassador to the UN, Dovid Efune, has had a lot of choice words about this specific appointment. He's new on the job. I mean, what can we expect from him when it comes to representing Israel in the United Nations?
Well, he's come in at quite a strange time in two ways. First of all, because of the coronavirus pandemic, he's not able to sort of engage people directly and build those person-to-person relations. He's also starting off as both the ambassador to the United States and the United Nations, so his attention is going to be pulled in different directions. But certainly, he's been responding to the big ticket items that affect Israel and the United States, and he has been using some strong words. I'll also stress I interviewed his predecessor, Ambassador Danon, in his final interview on the job. And he referred to the UN Human Rights Council as a circus. So it's very much in line with the Israeli position on the subject for some time.
All right. Dovid Efune, thank you so much for joining us and breaking that down.